So today we're going to take a look at what we call the broad relative clause. So most relative clauses, or what we call adjective clauses, are modifiers of a single noun, and most are introduced by a relative pronoun that refers just to that individual noun. For example, if I said Ashton's SUV, which he bought just last week, looks like a gas guzzler to me. Well, the adjective clause or the relative clause sitting right here, which is which he bought just last week, and it has this relative clause, a relative pronoun rather, which is the word which, and it's referring to a single noun on the outside, which is referring to referring to the SAT. I said SAT, oh my gosh, to the SUV, a one-track mind. All right, so the word which is referring to the SUV. It's the SUV that he bought just last week. And that's the way we would normally use what we call a relative clause. It's a single relative adjective clause referring to a single noun, and that word which is the relative pronoun referring to that one single noun. Good. Now, sometimes, though, when we use the word which, we actually are referring not to a particular single noun, but to a whole idea. And therefore, it turns into a very broad reference. So anytime we're referring to a broader reference or a full sentence, it comes under the category of a sentence modifier. So this is referred to a broad relative clause, sometimes referred to as the broad which. Let's take a look at what this looks like. So if I said Ashton bought a gas guzzler, which surprised me. Well, here's this adjective clause or relative clause, which surprised me. But in this case, it may not necessarily be describing just the gas guzzler. In this case, it seems to be describing the entire sentence. What surprised me? The fact that Ashton bought a gas guzzler. That whole thing surprised me. And therefore, the word which is now making a more broad reference to the full sentence as opposed to an individual noun. And this is what we call the broad relative clause or the broad which. So if I said Ashton's SUV, which he bought just last week, that's referring to a specific noun. But if I used the first sentence, it's referring to the full sentence. So all broad references are introduced with the word which. It's never by the word who or the word that. And all of them are non-restrictive, meaning they all need commas. So that's why we call it the broad which, because usually it's the word which is going to be causing us some trouble. So most writers avoid the broad reference relative clauses because once again, it can cause some ambiguity. So instead of using which only in adjectival clauses to refer to a specific noun, most writers are just going to say, look, I'm going to use it only for a specific noun as opposed to the broad which. So my recommendation is for you also to avoid the broad which. Here's the reason why. Inexperienced hands, it can oftentimes create some vagueness that's associated sometimes with dangling modifiers. Let me show you what I mean. If I said I broke out in a rash, which really bothered me, well, this is kind of the broad use of the word which. I can't tell what you mean. Does this word which refer to a single word like rash, in which case you're basically saying the rash bothered you? Or is it referring to the whole idea of breaking out into a rash? You know, if you refer to the word rash, maybe just avoid the word which. Maybe we should say the rash I got last week or the rash that I got last week really bothered me. Now it's more clear. But if you're referring to the whole idea of breaking out into a rash, once again, try using without the word which. Maybe breaking out in a rash really bothered me. So therefore, we've gotten rid of that word which, the broad use or the misuse of the word which, and we made it much more clear. But it's important for us to understand exactly what it looks like. So let's take a look at a diagram of this. Change my screens. Here we go. So what if I said the president criticized the Congress rather severely in his press conference, which surprised some observers, which some observers considered quite inappropriate? Well, I'll use my highlighter here. This whole thing of which some observers considered quite inappropriate, it's hard to tell what it's referring to. I don't think it's the press conference which the observers considered inappropriate, but the idea that he criticized Congress rather severely in this press conference. That whole thing seems to be rather inappropriate, and that's the broad use of the word which. So let's diagram it like we normally would with an adjective clause. So we have an outside sentence, which is the president criticized Congress. I'm going to build this close to the top here. So here's president. It's the president criticized, direct object, Congress. Sure why I said the Congress, but we'll just go with it. The Congress. And then he criticized them severely. I wrote severely. That doesn't make any sense. Let's go this way. Severely. Rather severely, a little adverb coming off that, rather severely. And he criticized them in his press conference. So in conference, his conference, and I'm going to flatten that word press as a noun serving as an adjective. Press conference. When I build this relative clause, which is which some observers considered quite inappropriate, once again, I'm just going to build it like a regular adjective clause. It's going to be separate, and I'm just going to find a place to put that word which. I already have a verb, which is considered, and I have a subject, which is observers, so let's start there. Some observers considered. And now I have a place for the word which. The word which is kind of sitting here as a direct object. The observers considered which, because I'm making a pattern 9, to be, and then here's my adjective, inappropriate. That word to be is kind of understood, and it's quite inappropriate. Now, normally I would take that word which, and I would have some kind of dash line back to some kind of noun. But I don't think it's connecting to the conference. The conference isn't inappropriate. Congress is inappropriate. The president's kind of acting in an inappropriate way, supposedly, in the sentence. But really what I'm saying is the fact that he criticized Congress, this whole thing is inappropriate. So, just take that out of here. Ooh. And so, lost a letter. And so in this case, instead of actually having a dashed line connecting which to a particular word, much like a lot of the structures in this particular unit, we have a sentence modifier. And basically, the word which is modifying the entire sentence. And so therefore, I don't want to connect it anyway. And so this is one where the clause would not connect at all. It's just going to float with no connection because the word which isn't referring to anything particularly. It's referring to the whole sentence. So we would consider this diagram complete. Good job.